What's the cutest favor you've done for a stranger that hurt your heart in the end? I thought I was watching the most romantic proposal I'd ever seen, not the most tragic one. I mean, there were rose petals everywhere, candles lining the pathway, a photographer hiding behind a potted plant. Like if Disney animated proposals, I was sure it would look like this. Even the guy had that Prince Eric look going for him. My coworker and I watched the entire thing play out from the receptionist's desk, holding our breaths as the man, Theo, bent down on one knee, holding his girlfriend's hand, staring into her eyes longingly. But when she looked at his face, we knew it was over. I can't. I'm so sorry, she said, pulling her hand back before running out, leaving him kneeling with the ring box open while everyone stared. I was heartbroken for him. My manager walked over and said heartlessly, "Go handle the guy. Get him out of sight if you have to." So I brought him water and pulled him away from all the people, hiding him in the employee area while he fought back tears. 4 years together and she said no. In front of everyone, Theo shuddered. "I know how you feel," I said, trying to comfort him. "No, you don't," he said bitterly. I laughed sadly. "Just 5 months ago, I got stood up at the altar. So trust me." "I know." He glanced at me with wide eyes and apologized. We talked for maybe 20 minutes after that, telling me all about the relationship, how much money he'd spent on the ring. What's worse is this trip I bought for us to celebrate the engagement in advance. Paid in full, non-refundable. She wanted a destination wedding in Greece, so I thought we could check it out first. But now this? Theo fell quiet, then turned to me. "Hey, would you want to go? With me? I know this is insane, but you said you got stood up too. Maybe we both deserve something good after all this bad luck." I thought he was delirious from shock. "You're not serious," he grinned. "I am. No strings. Just two people who got rejected finally catching a break." It was crazy, but the hopeful look in his eyes got to me. "Okay, yes. Let's go to Greece," I said. I should have said no. I met Theo at the airport days later, still half expecting it to be just an empty promise. But he was there with 2 suitcases and a vacation-ready shirt. He scrolled through old photos on his phone the entire flight, the heartbreak still clearly fresh on his mind. His face looked pained when the hotel upgraded us to the honeymoon suite, filled with rose petals, candles, champagne on ice, just like his proposal. I took hold of his hand and dragged him out of the room. "Okay, dinner first, crying later," I joked. But even throughout dinner, he was distracted, barely touching his food. I was tired of it. I finally said, "Look, I know this isn't what you planned, but we're here, and I'd hate it if you were miserable the entire time." He quickly put his phone away and apologized. "You're right. I'm sorry. You didn't sign up to babysit me." I shook my head. "Neither of us signed up for the heartbreak, so let's just try to have a good time, okay? Pinky swear on it." I held out my hand with a pinky extended. He looked down at it and burst into laughter before wrapping his pinky around mine. After that, Theo became more relaxed. We took a sailing trip around the caldera, enjoying the salty wind and sun together. Anytime he mentioned his ex, I made him jump into the waters. We rented out ATVs and raced through mountain villages, getting lost on purpose just to laugh about how bad we were with directions after. We danced together to live music in town and held hands while we strolled around. "No strings attached?" I teased. He grinned. "Definitely not." We ended the week with dinner on a terrace in Oya while the sun started setting and got to talking. "Why do you think your ex left you at the altar? Did you ever find out, he asked. I smiled softly and nodded, looking out at the amazing view. "Yeah, I found out. He chose another girl." "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said. I shook my head. "The girl he chose was his sister, so trust me, I'm happy I'm not a part of that family," I said nonchalantly. He spat out his drink. "No way," I grinned. "Just kidding. But to answer your question, no, I never found out why he left me there. Sometimes there's just not an answer to things. Maybe he just didn't want me around." "Well, I'm glad you're around now," Theo said, reaching over to move my hair behind my ear. "I don't know what I would have done without you here." He leaned over, his face just inches from mine, whispering, "What if we—" Just then, his phone buzzed. I pulled back and smiled. "How about you check that first, then kiss me after?" His face turned pale as he looked at the screen. "It's her." My chest tightened. "She says she made a mistake, that she wants me back and wants to try again," he said, leaning back in his chair with a hurt expression. The magic was gone after that. He spent the next few days acting distant, constantly on his phone, texting and calling. When we arrived home at the airport, his ex-girlfriend ran up and gave him a tearful hug. "Your mom told me your flight. Please. I love you. I made a mistake." Theo glanced at me like he wanted to say something, but I wasn't ready to hear it. "I'm sorry. I'll be right back. Just wait for me. Please." But I couldn't wait. I grabbed my suitcase handle and turned toward the exit signs, weaving through families reuniting and business travelers checking their phones. My chest felt tight and my eyes burned, but I refused to let tears fall in public again, not after the wedding that never happened 5 months ago. The automatic doors opened and I stepped into the pickup area where taxis lined up along the curb. I raised my hand and a yellow cab pulled forward. The driver popped the trunk and I lifted my suitcase inside, then slid into the back seat and gave him my address. He pulled into traffic and I stared out the window watching the airport disappear behind us. The meter ticked up slowly, and I calculated how much this ride would cost, realizing it would be around $60 I hadn't planned to spend. My brain kept replaying that moment on the terrace in Greece when Theo leaned close and whispered, "What if?" His face just inches from mine, before his phone buzzed with her text. I wondered if I imagined the connection between us, or if he felt it too before she reached out. The cab merged onto the highway, and I watched other cars pass by. All those people going somewhere with purpose, while I felt stuck between what almost happened and what actually did. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to my apartment building, and I handed the driver 320s, telling him to keep the change, even though I couldn't afford to be generous. I dragged my suitcase up the front steps and into the lobby, then took the elevator to the 4th floor. My apartment door stuck a little like it always did, and I had to push hard with my shoulder to get it open. I dropped my bags right there in the entryway and walked to the couch, pulling out my phone to call my brother Valentino, because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for feeling this hurt over a guy I barely knew. He answered on the second ring, and I started talking immediately, telling him everything about the Greece trip and how Theo spent the whole week getting over his ex until that last dinner when we almost kissed. I explained about the text message and how Theo went distant after that, spending the rest of the trip on his phone. I described the airport scene with his ex-girlfriend running up to hug him while I stood there with my suitcase like an idiot. Valentino listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said exactly what I expected. He reminded me I went to Greece with a stranger who got dumped literally days before his trip, and asked what I thought would happen. His words stung, even though he wasn't wrong. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking my suitcase and putting clothes in the laundry hamper, feeling stupid for believing in romantic gestures and thinking a rebound trip could turn into something real. I found a seashell I picked up from the beach in Santorini and almost threw it away, but ended up putting it on my bookshelf instead. 3 days passed before I had to return to work, and I spent most of that time sleeping late and avoiding my phone. When I finally walked into the hotel lobby on Monday morning, my coworker Hadley spotted me immediately and pulled me aside near the supply closet. Her eyes were bright with curiosity, and she asked how the trip went, clearly expecting a romantic story. I gave her the short version ending with the airport reunion, and watched her face fall as she realized it didn't have a happy ending. She hugged me right there by the reception desk and said, "Men are idiots." We walked back to our stations and I logged into the computer system, checking the schedule for upcoming events and trying to focus on normal work tasks. My manager Rory came by during the afternoon shift overlap and noticed I was quieter than usual. He asked if everything was okay, and I told him I was just tired from travel, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. He accepted my explanation easily and moved on to discuss some booking changes for next week. Hadley shot me a knowing look from across the desk that said we would talk about this later over drinks. That night, she took me to a dive bar 3 blocks from our apartment complex, a place with sticky floors and cheap beer that we usually avoided. We sat at a corner booth and I finally told her everything, including the part about my ex leaving me at the altar 5 months ago. She listened with her hand on mine and didn't interrupt even when I got emotional talking about how I thought Theo and I understood each other because we both got was rejected. When I finished, she looked at me carefully and said I was trying to fix him instead of dealing with my own stuff. Something about hearing it out loud made me realize she was completely right. I had thrown myself into helping Theo feel better because it was easier than facing my own heartbreak. We ordered another round and talked about other things for a while. Normal friend stuff about work and her graduate classes and a movie she wanted to see. When I got home around 11, I felt exhausted, but also lighter somehow. Like admitting the truth out loud had taken some weight off my chest. I woke up the next morning to my phone buzzing on the nightstand and grabbed it to check the time. There was a text from Theo sent at 2 in the morning saying he was sorry, and he should have said goodbye. The message said, "I deserved better than watching him walk away like that." I stared at the screen for 10 minutes trying to figure out what I wanted to say back. I typed out several responses, but everything sounded either desperate or angry, so I deleted them all. Finally, I just locked my phone and put it face down on the nightstand. I got up and made coffee and ate breakfast while deliberately not thinking about what to text him back. By the time I left for work, I still hadn't responded, and I told myself that was probably the right choice. 3 days went by with no more messages from Theo, and I started to relax into my normal routine again. I picked up extra shifts at the hotel and made sure to avoid walking past the spot where his proposal happened. The rose petals were long gone, but I still felt weird being near that area. Hadley found me in the break room on Thursday and said she signed us up for a pottery class that night. She explained I needed a hobby that had nothing to do with romance or work, and I agreed because she was probably right about that too. We left work at 5 and drove to a studio in the Arts District, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and big windows. The instructor was a woman in her 50s with clay-stained hands who introduced herself and showed us to our wheels. She demonstrated how to center the clay and pull up the walls of a bowl, making it look easy even though I could tell it wasn't. The first pottery class turned out to be way harder than I expected. My hands were covered in wet clay that wouldn't cooperate no matter what I did. The wheel spun too fast and then too slow, and my attempts at making a bowl kept collapsing into lumpy messes. But there was something satisfying about focusing on something physical and creative, using my hands to shape something instead of just thinking in circles about my problems. The instructor was patient and came over several times to help me adjust my technique. The other students were friendly without being nosy, just people who wanted to learn pottery for their own reasons. For 2 hours, I didn't think about Theo or my ex or failed relationships at all. I just focused on the clay and the wheel and trying to make something that resembled a bowl. By the end of class, my back hurt and my hands were sore, but I had created a small lopsided pot that the instructor said we could fire in the kiln next week. Sunday morning arrived, and I was working the reception desk during the slow breakfast hours, checking in a few guests and answering phone calls about room availability. I glanced up from my computer screen and saw Theo walk through the hotel lobby with his ex-girlfriend. They were both laughing about something, and she had her hand on his arm. My stomach dropped, and I ducked behind my computer screen fast, praying they wouldn't notice me sitting there. I held my breath and watched through the gap between the monitor and the desk as they walked straight to the elevator bank without glancing toward reception. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside, still talking and smiling, and then the doors closed, and they were gone. I sat there frozen for a minute, trying to process what I just saw, my heart beating too fast in my chest. I stayed behind that computer screen for another minute, trying to get my breathing under control, but my chest kept getting tighter and my hands started shaking. I mumbled something to the other receptionist about taking a break and walked fast toward the employee area, pushing through the break room door and leaning against the wall with my eyes closed. My breath came in short gasps, and I pressed my palms against my face, trying to stop the spinning feeling in my head. The door opened and I heard footsteps, then Hadley's voice saying my name softly. She didn't ask what was wrong or tell me to calm down, just pulled out a chair and guided me into it before filling a paper cup with water from the cooler. She sat in the chair next to mine and put her hand on my back, not saying anything while I focused on breathing slower and drinking the water in small sips. After maybe 10 minutes, my hands stopped shaking and I could breathe normally again. Hadley waited until I looked up at her before asking if I was okay. I told her about seeing Theo and his ex walking through the lobby, how they looked so happy together, how I hid like a scared kid instead of acting normal. She squeezed my shoulder and said hiding was a completely reasonable reaction and I shouldn't feel bad about it. Then she asked if I wanted to talk to Rory about not working proposal events anymore, since clearly romantic stuff was hitting too close right now. I hadn't thought about that option, but it made sense, so I nodded and said I'd try to set up a meeting. The next morning, I knocked on Rory's office door during his usual admin time and asked if he had a few minutes. He waved me in and I sat across from his desk trying to figure out how to explain without oversharing. I told him I was struggling with romantic events at the hotel right now due to some personal stuff, keeping it vague and professional. He leaned back in his chair and asked if this was about the proposal guy from a few weeks ago, and I felt my face get hot, but admitted it was related to that situation. Rory nodded slowly and said he could rotate me to other duties during proposal bookings, handling more check-ins and guest services instead. He warned me he couldn't promise I'd never see couples at the hotel since we were literally a hotel, but he could minimize my direct involvement with romantic events. I thanked him and felt this huge wave of relief that he didn't make it weird or ask for details. Walking back to reception, I felt lighter, like I'd taken some control back instead of just reacting to everything. That afternoon, I finally opened the text thread with Theo that I'd been avoiding for days. His apology message was still sitting there unanswered, and I knew I needed to respond, even though I didn't want to. I typed out a message saying thank you for apologizing, that I needed space right now, and I hoped things worked out for him. My finger hovered over the send button for at least 5 minutes before I finally pressed it. Then I stared at my phone for another hour waiting for his response, my stomach doing flips every time the screen lit up with a notification that wasn't from him. Finally, the 3 dots appeared showing he was typing, then disappeared, then appeared again. His message came through saying he understood, and there was a heart emoji at the end that made me want to throw my phone across the room. I shoved it in my pocket and tried to focus on work, but kept pulling it back out to reread his message and overanalyze what the heart emoji meant. That evening, my phone rang with Valentino's name on the screen, and I answered while making dinner in my tiny apartment kitchen. He asked how I was doing in that big brother voice that meant he already knew something was wrong. I told him about seeing Theo at the hotel with his ex, how they looked so comfortable together, how it felt like a punch to the stomach. Valentino got immediately protective and angry, saying Theo had no right to bring her to my workplace and put me in that position. I pointed out that Theo probably didn't even know I was working that day, and the hotel wasn't exactly mine to control, but Valentino insisted it was still inconsiderate. We talked for almost an hour while I cooked pasta, and he told me about his week, and by the end, I felt steadier having someone in my corner who wasn't trying to fix anything. The next pottery class on Thursday went way better than the first one. My hands felt more confident on the clay, and I actually managed to center it properly this time. The instructor came over and adjusted my grip, showing me how to pull up the walls without collapsing them. After an hour of work, I had something that actually resembled a bowl, lopsided and imperfect, but definitely mine. The instructor looked at it and said I'd improved a lot since last week, then suggested I come to the open studio hours on Saturdays if I wanted more practice time. I pulled out my phone right there and added it to my calendar, feeling like maybe I was building something new for myself instead of just trying to fix what broke. 2 weeks passed with me working extra shifts and going to pottery class, and generally keeping busy enough that I didn't obsess over my phone constantly. Then on a Tuesday morning, I woke up to a text from Theo asking if we could talk in person, saying he owed me a real explanation and apology. My chest got tight reading it, and I immediately screenshot the message to send to Hadley. She responded within minutes saying absolutely not. He was just feeling guilty and wanted me to make him feel better about his choices. I stared at both messages and realized she was completely right, but some part of me still wanted to hear what he had to say. I spent 3 whole days thinking about how to respond, typing and deleting different versions. Finally, I sent back a message saying I appreciated that but wasn't ready yet, maybe in a few weeks. His response came through immediately saying he'd wait as long as I needed, which somehow made me feel worse instead of better like he probably intended. Work became my safe space over the next couple weeks, and I picked up every extra shift Rory offered. The money was good, and staying busy meant I didn't have time to sit around obsessing over text messages and what-ifs. Rory noticed me taking on more hours and pulled me aside one afternoon to mention there might be a supervisor position opening up in a few months. He said he'd been impressed with my work ethic and thought I should apply when it posted. I thanked him and walked away feeling like I finally had something concrete to focus on besides my messy personal life. At the next pottery class, I ended up chatting with another student named Duncan during our break. He'd been coming for 6 months apparently, and still couldn't make anything that didn't look like a blob. But he joked about it constantly in a way that made everyone laugh. We talked about how hard centering clay was, and he mentioned a local art fair happening next weekend, suggesting a group of us from class should go together. I agreed without overthinking it, and he added me to a group chat with 2 other students to plan the details. The art fair outing turned out to be exactly what I needed, just casual and fun with no pressure. 4 of us from pottery class wandered through rows of vendor booths looking at paintings and jewelry and weird sculptures. Duncan kept making commentary on the art that had me laughing, so hard I had to stop walking. We ate overpriced food truck meals sitting on the grass and talked about everything except relationships or drama. For the first time in weeks, I felt light and present instead of stuck in my head replaying airport scenes and almost kisses in Greece. That night, my phone buzzed while I was getting ready for bed, and Theo's name lit up the screen. I sat down on my couch and opened the message. He wrote that he broke up with her and thought I should know, saying I was right about everything. My chest did something weird and uncomfortable, like my ribcage was squeezing too tight. I stared at those words for what felt like forever, trying to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Part of me wanted to feel happy or relieved, but mostly I just felt confused and kind of sad. I spent the next hour sitting there in my pajamas, phone in my lap, going through every possible meaning behind his text. Was he telling me because he wanted me back? Or because he felt guilty? Or because he genuinely thought I deserved to know? I couldn't figure it out, and eventually I gave up trying. Took a screenshot of the message and sent it to Hadley without any explanation. She responded in under 2 minutes with a wall of text that basically said, "Do not respond under any circumstances because he was love-bombing me now that his backup plan failed." I read her message 3 times and realized she was probably right, but some small part of me still wanted to believe he was being honest. The next day at work, I could barely focus on anything, constantly checking my phone to see if he'd sent anything else. He hadn't. During my lunch break, I called the employee assistance program number that had been sitting in my wallet for months and scheduled an appointment with a therapist named Graciela for later that week. When I told Hadley I'd made a therapy appointment, she hugged me right there in the break room and said she was proud of me. The therapy office was in a medical building downtown with bland waiting room art and uncomfortable chairs. Graciela turned out to be this woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice that made me feel less nervous. She asked me what brought me in, and I ended up telling her everything. The whole messy story from getting stood up at my wedding to Greece to the airport scene to Theo's breakup text. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me what I actually wanted, not what I thought I should want, or what would make the best story. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea. We spent the rest of the session talking about my pattern of trying to rescue people and how it connected to being left at the altar. She said something about how I kept trying to prove I was worth choosing by making myself useful to people who were hurting. That hit me hard enough that I had to look away and focus on the tissue box on her desk. By the time I left, I felt raw and exposed, but also somehow clearer, like she'd helped me see something I'd been avoiding. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes just breathing and processing before I could drive home. 4 days went by before I finally responded to Theo's text. I must have typed and deleted 20 different versions, trying to find the right words. Finally, I just wrote that I was glad he was making choices that felt right for him, but I was still working on figuring out what I needed, and that meant continuing to take space for now. I hit send before I could overthink it anymore. His response came through within an hour, mature and respectful, saying he understood completely, and that he'd started seeing a therapist too. Something about that made me feel both better and worse at the same time. The weeks passed, and suddenly it was late October. The hotel got decorated with these elegant autumn arrangements, pumpkins and fall leaves arranged in expensive vases throughout the lobby. I was working the afternoon shift when I realized I'd made it almost 2 months since Greece without completely falling apart. Hadley found me during my break and asked if I wanted to come to a costume party her roommate was throwing for Halloween. She promised it would be low-key, mostly people from her graduate program who wouldn't ask intrusive questions about my personal life. I agreed because staying home alone on Halloween sounded depressing. I ended up putting together a detective costume from thrift store finds, a tan trench coat, and a big magnifying glass, leaning into the joke that I was investigating my own life. The party was actually fun, held in a cramped apartment with string lights and a playlist of spooky music. Hadley's friends turned out to be warm and funny, the kind of people who made you feel included without trying too hard. I spent most of the night talking to different people about grad school drama and terrible professors and favorite horror movies. One woman named Melissa, dressed as an architect with a hard hat and blueprints, kept making me laugh with her stories about her thesis advisor. We talked for maybe an hour about everything except relationships, and before I left, she asked for my number to get coffee sometime. I added her contact info, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The following week, Melissa and I met at a coffee shop near campus. She ordered some complicated latte, and I got my usual black coffee, and we settled into a corner table by the window. We talked about our jobs and hobbies and favorite podcasts, the conversation flowing easily without any awkward pauses. She mentioned she'd been single for 2 years by choice after a bad breakup, and there was something refreshing about how content she seemed with her own company. She didn't treat being single like a problem that needed fixing, or a temporary state before the next relationship. We stayed for almost 3 hours, only leaving when the barista started putting chairs up on tables. On a random Tuesday evening, my phone buzzed with another text from Theo. I was making dinner and almost ignored it, but curiosity won. He wrote that he knew I asked for space, but wanted me to know he was doing the work, that therapy was hard, but good, and he was learning a lot about why he proposed when he did, and how he used our trip as an escape. He ended by saying I deserved better. I screenshotted immediately to show Graciela at our next session. When I saw Graciela 2 days later, she asked me what accountability actually looked like versus performative apology. We talked about the difference between someone doing the work for themselves versus doing it to win someone back. She asked if I wanted to respond to Theo or if I was ready to block his number entirely. I realized I wasn't ready for either extreme. I wanted to leave the door open for friendship eventually, but not right now when everything still felt tender and complicated. She nodded like that made perfect sense, and we moved on to talking about other things. My pottery skills had improved enough that I actually made a mug that held water without leaking. It was still lopsided and the handle was slightly crooked, but it was mine and it worked. I brought it to work the next day and used it at my desk during my morning shift. Rory walked by and stopped to look at it, asking about the pottery class. I found myself talking enthusiastically about the creative process, how satisfying it felt to make something with my own hands, to see improvement week after week. He listened with genuine interest and mentioned he'd been thinking about taking a woodworking class. We talked for a few minutes about hobbies and having creative outlets outside of work, and I walked away from that conversation feeling good about myself in a way that had nothing to do with romance or drama. Thanksgiving week rolled around, and Valentino called asking if I wanted to come stay with him and his wife for the holiday. I told him I appreciated the invite, but I'd already signed up to volunteer at a community dinner downtown. He sounded surprised, but said he was proud of me for getting out there and doing something good. Hadley texted me the night before asking if she could join, saying her family was 3 states away and she didn't feel like traveling. We showed up at the community center early Thursday morning and spent the next 8 hours serving mashed potatoes and turkey to a steady stream of people. Some were homeless, some were elderly, some were just families who needed a free meal. Hadley worked the dessert station while I handled vegetables, and we talked to everyone who came through our line. An older woman told me about her grandkids, a young guy talked about his job search, a family of 4 thanked us about 6 times. By the end of the day, my feet hurt and my back ached, but I felt genuinely good about myself in a way that had nothing to do with whether someone wanted to date me or not. The day after Thanksgiving, I woke up to a text from Theo, just a photo of a sunset over water with the caption, "Thought of you," and nothing else. I stared at it for probably 10 minutes lying in bed, feeling that familiar tug in my chest like a hook pulling me back toward him. The colors were beautiful, orange and pink bleeding into purple, and I wondered where he was and why he sent it, and what he wanted me to say back. Then I archived the conversation without responding, and got dressed to go to open studio hours at the pottery place. I spent 3 hours there working on a new bowl, focusing on keeping the walls even and the rim smooth, and every time my mind wandered back to that sunset photo, I redirected it to the clay spinning under my hands. December started with a cold snap that made everyone at the hotel cranky, but we were so busy with holiday parties and winter wedding bookings that I barely had time to think about anything else. We had corporate events almost every night, plus several weekend weddings where couples wanted that winter wonderland vibe with fake snow and ice sculptures. I worked doubles most weeks and came home exhausted, but grateful for the distraction. Rory pulled me aside one afternoon during a lull at the reception desk and asked if I had a few minutes to talk in his office. I followed him back there, trying not to panic, wondering if I'd messed something up, but he just smiled and offered me a chair. He said the current supervisor was transferring to another property in January, and he wanted to offer me the position, which came with a pay raise and more regular hours instead of the rotating schedule I currently worked. I accepted immediately, trying to keep my voice professional even though I wanted to jump up and hug him. He shook my hand and said I'd earned it through my dedication and reliability, and I walked out of his office feeling proud of myself for achieving something concrete that I'd worked for. At pottery class that week, Duncan came over while I was wedging clay and asked if I wanted to see a movie sometime. Just as friends, since we both seemed to like terrible action films. I agreed easily because there wasn't any pressure or weirdness, just 2 people who enjoyed hanging out making plans. We went that Saturday to see some ridiculous movie about car chases and explosions, the kind where you don't have to think too hard, and afterward we got pizza at a place nearby. We talked about our jobs and our families and the pottery class, and I realized I was rebuilding my ability to trust people in small, manageable steps without expecting anything complicated to develop. My next therapy session with Graciela focused on identifying what I actually wanted in a relationship versus what I thought I should want, based on movies or other people's expectations. She had me make a list, writing down each quality as I thought of it: honesty, emotional availability, someone who does their own work, shared values, ability to be alone without being lonely. When I finished, she asked me to read it back, and I realized it was the first time I'd thought about dating again, without feeling anxious or scared, or like I needed to protect myself from getting hurt. On December 15th, Theo texted me again, this time with actual words instead of just a photo. The message said he wasn't trying to pressure me, but he'd really like to talk in person if I was ever ready, that he understood if the answer was no, but he wanted me to know the option was there. I sat with that message for 2 full days, reading it probably 50 times, trying to figure out what I felt and what I wanted, and whether I was ready for any kind of conversation with him. Finally, I screenshot it and sent it to both Hadley and Graciela asking for their perspectives. Hadley's response came back fast, saying I should tell him to leave me alone permanently and stop letting him dangle this possibility in front of me whenever he felt like it. Graciela's response was gentler, just asking what I was afraid would happen if I agreed to meet him. I thought about that question for hours, sitting with it during my work shift and my pottery class and my drive home. I realized I was scared I'd fall back into caretaking mode, scared I'd ignore red flags because I wanted the story to have a happy ending, scared I'd lose all the progress I'd made over the past few months. After another week of thinking and talking it through in therapy, I finally responded to Theo's message. I told him I was willing to meet for coffee in a public place, 30 minutes maximum, just to talk, but he needed to understand I wasn't promising anything beyond that one conversation. His response came back within minutes saying he understood completely and suggesting a cafe near the pottery studio for the following Saturday. We confirmed the time and I immediately told Hadley, who made me promise to text her every 15 minutes and leave immediately if I felt uncomfortable at all. I agreed because having an exit plan made the whole thing feel safer and more manageable. The night before meeting Theo, I barely slept, lying awake running through every possible conversation in my head. I imagined him apologizing, imagined him asking for another chance, imagined him telling me he was seeing someone else, imagined myself saying yes or no, or maybe to various scenarios. By morning, I was exhausted and jittery, drinking too much coffee and changing my outfit 3 times before settling on jeans and a sweater that felt casual and comfortable. I arrived at the cafe 5 minutes early and sat in my car gathering my nerve, then walked in and ordered a black coffee before choosing a table by the window where I could see the street. Theo showed up exactly on time, looking different from I remembered. More settled somehow, like he'd been sleeping better and taking care of himself. We sat down across from each other with our drinks between us, and there was this long, awkward silence where we both just looked at each other, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, he smiled kind of nervously and said he was really glad I agreed to this, that he wasn't sure I would. He took a breath and started talking about his therapy sessions, explaining how his therapist helped him see that he proposed because he was scared of losing his ex after 4 years together. It wasn't about being ready for marriage, he said. It was about trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. He talked about how he used our Greece trip as a way to run from his feelings instead of dealing with them, and how unfair that was to me. I watched his face while he talked, looking for any sign that he was just performing this confession, but his eyes looked honest and a little sad. He kept his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and didn't check his phone once. He told me about working through his fear of being alone and how he realized he didn't actually know who he was outside of that relationship. When he finished talking, he looked at me and waited, not pushing for a response. I took a minute to gather my thoughts before telling him about my own therapy work with Graciela. I explained how I'd started to see this pattern in my life where I tried to fix broken people instead of dealing with my own problems. The Greece trip was me trying to prove I could be chosen, I said, that I was still worth something after being left at the altar. I told him how I realized I was using him to feel better about myself, which wasn't fair to either of us. He nodded while I talked, and I could tell he understood what I meant. We both sat there for a while after that, just drinking our coffee and watching people walk by outside the window. The silence felt okay instead of awkward. Finally, Theo asked what I needed from him going forward. I thought about it for a second before answering honestly. I told him I needed time to keep working on myself without worrying about what we were or could be. I needed to know he was doing his own work for himself, not because he thought it might lead to us getting together. He listened carefully, and then said he understood completely. He suggested we check in once a month, just to see how we were both doing, with no pressure beyond friendship. Something about hearing him say that made my shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in months. He agreed right away when I said that sounded good, and then we ended up talking for way longer than 30 minutes. We stayed at that cafe for over an hour, laughing about the terrible Greek food we'd eaten and the time we crashed our ATVs into a fence. He told me about a cooking class he'd signed up for, and I told him about my pottery progress. When we finally left the cafe, I felt lighter somehow, like we'd cleared the air between us. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot, and it felt friendly instead of complicated. Walking home, I pulled out my phone and texted Hadley that the meeting went okay, that we were going to try being friends with clear boundaries. She responded fast with a bunch of skeptical emojis, but then added that she trusted my judgment. Reading those words made something settle in my chest, because that was exactly what I needed to hear. The holidays came and went quietly after that. I threw myself into pottery classes and got better at centering the clay on the wheel. Work picked up with all the holiday parties at the hotel, and I took extra shifts to save money. Hadley and I hung out most weekends, trying new restaurants and watching movies at her apartment. I met her friend Melissa at a holiday party, and we clicked right away, exchanging numbers to get coffee later. Theo and I texted on Christmas morning, just simple messages wishing each other a good day. Nothing heavy or romantic, just friendly check-ins that felt comfortable. I spent Christmas with Valentino and his wife, eating too much food and playing board games. For the first time in months, I felt okay about where my life was heading. January started with my promotion to supervisor, and I felt the difference right away. Rory spent 2 weeks training me on scheduling and how to handle conflicts between staff members. I discovered I was actually good at managing people and solving problems, which surprised me. The other receptionists started coming to me with questions, and I liked being able to help them. The pay raise meant I could finally afford to take the intermediate pottery class I'd been eyeing. My days felt full in a good way, with work and hobbies and friends filling up my calendar. I wasn't waiting around for anything to happen anymore. I was just living my life. Theo and I met for our monthly coffee in mid-January at the same cafe. He told me about a career opportunity he was thinking about taking, something with more travel that his ex had always said was too risky. I could tell he was excited about it even though he seemed nervous to make the change. I told him about my promotion and showed him photos of the bowls I'd made in pottery class. We talked like actual friends instead of two people trying to figure out if they should date. When we said goodbye that day, I realized I genuinely enjoyed spending time with him without all the other stuff getting in the way. Valentine's Day rolled around in February, and I braced myself for it to be hard. But instead of moping, I organized a night with Hadley and Melissa, where we cooked fancy pasta and watched the worst romantic comedies we could find. We made fun of the unrealistic plot lines and ate too much chocolate. Theo sent me a text that just said he was thinking of me and hoped I was doing well. I appreciated that he acknowledged the day without making it weird or romantic. I texted back thanking him and telling him about our movie marathon. The whole day felt easy instead of painful. Late February brought warmer weather, and Theo texted asking if I wanted to go to an art museum exhibit with him. He made it clear it wasn't a date, but thought I might like it because of my pottery interest. I agreed, and we spent a Saturday afternoon walking through galleries full of ceramics and sculptures. We talked about technique and what made certain pieces beautiful. He pointed out details I hadn't noticed, and I explained some of the pottery methods I'd learned in class. The whole afternoon felt natural and simple, like hanging out with a friend who got my interests. When we grabbed dinner after at a casual place nearby, I realized this was what healthy friendship looked like after everything we'd been through. Theo picked at his pasta and glanced at his phone, then set it down with a small smile. He mentioned he'd been trying out some dating apps, nothing serious yet, just meeting people for coffee and seeing what was out there. I felt my shoulders relax instead of tense up, which surprised me until I realized this was exactly what I needed to hear. We were actually building something real here, not just waiting around for some perfect moment to try romance again. I told him about my own coffee date from last week, this guy who spent 40 minutes talking about his workout routine and never asked me a single question. Theo laughed and said his last date had brought her ex-boyfriend up 6 times in 30 minutes. We spent the rest of dinner swapping terrible first date stories, and it felt easy, like talking to an actual friend instead of someone I was trying to impress. When we were leaving, he asked if I'd ever consider dating him again someday, and I stopped on the sidewalk to think about my answer. I told him maybe, but only when we were both completely sure we were choosing each other for the right reasons, not just because we had a good story to tell people. He nodded slowly and said that was fair, that he wanted the same thing. The walk to our cars felt comfortable instead of awkward, and when we hugged goodbye, it was quick and friendly without any lingering tension. March showed up with warmer weather, and I signed myself up for the intermediate pottery class, ready to try more complicated projects than basic bowls. Duncan from my original class joined too, and we ended up sitting at wheels next to each other every week. He started texting me memes about pottery fails, and we'd meet for breakfast on Saturday mornings before open studio hours. There was nothing romantic about it, just two people who liked making things with clay and could laugh at themselves when projects collapsed. The instructor taught us how to throw taller pieces and work with different glazes, and I loved the challenge of pushing my skills further. My hands got stronger and my centering got faster, and every finished piece felt like proof I was actually good at something new. Theo and I kept up our monthly coffee dates and started doing other activities together, like going to a farmer's market or trying a new hiking trail. I noticed how much more relaxed we both were without the pressure of figuring out what we were supposed to be. During one coffee date in late March, he told me his therapist said he'd made real progress on his attachment issues, that he was learning to be okay alone instead of jumping into relationships to avoid feeling empty. I shared that Graciela thought I'd developed much healthier boundaries, that I was getting better at saying no to things that didn't serve me. We clinked our coffee cups together like a toast, and agreed we were both doing the work, separately and together. Early April brought an unexpected conversation when Theo's ex-girlfriend apparently reached out to him again. He told me about it during our coffee date, asking for my perspective as a friend, instead of someone who might get jealous. We talked through his feelings, and I helped him see that he wasn't interested in going back, that he could feel compassion for her without wanting to restart anything. He thanked me for helping him think it through clearly, and I felt proud of both of us for having this conversation without any drama or weirdness. It confirmed we were actually friends now, not just two people pretending while secretly hoping for more. Hadley burst into the break room at work one day in mid-April with huge news about getting accepted to a PhD program across the country starting in the fall. I hugged her tight and told her how amazing that was, even though my chest felt tight thinking about her leaving. We started planning all the things we wanted to do together before she moved, making lists during our lunch breaks of restaurants to try to day trips to take. One night over drinks, I realized out loud that I'd built a life I actually liked, not just a placeholder existence while I waited for romance to show up and make everything better. Hadley squeezed my hand and said she'd noticed the change in me, that I seemed more solid somehow. Valentino visited in late April, and I took him to lunch with Theo, figuring it was time my brother met this person who'd become such a regular part of my life. They got along fine, talking about sports and work stuff while I ate my sandwich and watched them interact. Afterward, walking back to my apartment, Valentino asked if I was sure I wasn't just waiting around for Theo, putting my life on hold for someone who might never be ready. I stopped walking and told him honestly that I wasn't, that I was building my own life and if Theo ended up being part of it, that was a bonus, not the goal. Valentino studied my face for a minute, then nodded and said he believed me, that he could see the difference in how I carried myself now. May arrived with perfect weather, and I created my best pottery piece yet, a large bowl with a glaze I'd mixed myself using 3 different colors. The instructor held it up during class and suggested I consider selling my work at local craft fairs, that I had real talent and people would buy pieces like this. The idea scared me and excited me in equal measure, and I realized this was what actual growth felt like, being terrified but doing it anyway instead of playing it safe. I took photos of the bowl from every angle and sent them to Hadley, Theo, and Valentino, feeling proud in a way I hadn't felt in years. The Spring Music Festival happened on a perfect Saturday in late May, and I went with a whole group including Theo, Duncan, and Melissa. We wandered between stages, dancing badly to terrible cover bands and eating too much overpriced festival food. Someone took a photo of our whole group laughing at Duncan's attempt to crowd surf, and I made it my phone background that night because it captured something real. Being around Theo felt natural and easy, just another friend in the group instead of someone I had to constantly analyze every interaction with. We split a huge order of fries and argued about which band was the worst, and it was simple and good. During a quiet moment late in the afternoon, Theo and I ended up sitting on the grass away from the crowds, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. He said he was really glad we did this the slow way, that he thought we would have completely messed it up if we'd tried to date right after Greece. I agreed completely, thinking about how different this felt from those intense days in Oya. We sat in comfortable silence that felt more intimate than any of our romantic moments in Greece had, just 2 people who'd done the hard work and come out the other side as actual friends. The music from the main stage drifted over, and I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun and the solid ground beneath me, thinking about how far I'd come from that girl who'd said yes to a stranger's crazy invitation at the airport. Early June arrived with warm weather and longer days, and Theo asked if I wanted to grab coffee on a Saturday morning. We sat at our usual table near the window, and he seemed nervous, playing with his cup and looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said he'd been thinking a lot in therapy about what he wanted, and he wanted to be honest with me about something. My stomach did a weird flip, but I stayed quiet and let him talk. He told me he was ready to try dating me for real if I was interested, but he wanted me to know there was no pressure at all, and our friendship mattered way more to him than testing out romantic potential. I appreciated how careful he was being with his words, how much thought he'd clearly put into this conversation. I told him I needed a week to think about it, that this was important, and I didn't want to give him an answer right away. He nodded and said to take as long as I needed, that he wasn't going anywhere and whatever I decided would be okay. We finished our coffee talking about normal stuff, and when we hugged goodbye outside the shop, it felt comfortable instead of loaded with expectations. I spent the next week talking to everyone who knew me well, starting with Graciela in our Tuesday therapy session. She asked me what I was afraid of and what I was hoping for, and I realized my fears were much smaller than they used to be. I called Valentino that night and he listened to me talk through my thoughts, then said he trusted me to make the right choice for myself, and he could tell I'd done the work to get here. Hadley and I met for dinner Wednesday, and she said she'd support whatever I decided, that she could see how different I was now compared to last summer. I even talked to Melissa over coffee on Friday, and she pointed out that I'd built a whole life I loved, and Theo would just be adding to it, not completing it. By Sunday, I sat in my apartment looking at all the pottery pieces I'd made over the past year, thinking about my promotion at work and my friendships and my therapy progress, and I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Even if things with Theo didn't work out, I wouldn't lose myself this time because I'd learned how to choose myself first. I texted Theo on Monday, asking if he wanted to meet for coffee again, and he showed up looking hopeful, but trying to hide it. I told him yes before he even sat down, that I wanted to try dating him for real. His whole face lit up, but then he got serious and said he wanted to make sure we did this right. We spent an hour talking about what that meant, agreeing to 1 actual date per week while keeping our friendship as the foundation, checking in regularly about how we were feeling, being honest if something felt off. He suggested our first official date should be something fun and low pressure, and I immediately thought of the pottery studio. We signed up for a couples class that Saturday and spent 2 hours making matching mugs that turned out terrible and lopsided, but we laughed the entire time and our hands kept bumping in the clay. The instructor took a photo of us holding up our awful creations, and Theo set it as his phone background right there in class. Walking to our cars afterward felt different from all our friend hangouts, like we'd crossed some invisible line into new territory, but it was a good kind of different. The summer unfolded with slow and careful dating where we both stayed committed to honesty and doing our own work while building something together. We had hard conversations about expectations and fears, sitting in his car after dates and talking until midnight about what we needed and what scared us. I kept going to therapy every week, and so did he, and we maintained our individual friendships and hobbies without letting the relationship consume everything. I still did pottery on Thursdays and met Melissa for coffee and worked my supervisor shifts at the hotel. Theo kept up with his running group and his book club and his own friend circle. We celebrated small moments of connection, like when he brought me coffee at work, or when I showed up at his apartment with takeout after he had a rough day, but we didn't make those moments mean more than they actually did. Some dates were amazing, and some were just okay, and we learned to be honest about both. We had our first real argument in July about something stupid, and worked through it without either of us shutting down or running away, and that felt like a bigger win than any perfect romantic moment could have been. By August, I found myself sitting in my apartment on a Sunday morning using the lopsided mug I'd made in my very first pottery class, the one that barely held liquid without dripping. I was texting with Theo about maybe going hiking next weekend, while also making separate plans with Duncan and Melissa for a museum trip on Saturday. My calendar had work shifts and therapy appointments and pottery classes and friend hangs and date nights all mixed together in a way that felt full but not overwhelming. I looked around my apartment at the pottery pieces on my shelves and the photos on my walls and the life I'd built over the past year, and something clicked into place. This was what I'd actually wanted all along without knowing how to name it. A full life where romance was part of the picture but not the whole thing, where I chose myself first and someone else second. The story wasn't about being rescued or rescuing someone else, but about two people who'd both done their own hard work and decided to try building something together anyway. I finished my coffee and texted Theo back about the hiking plan, then opened my laptop to look at local craft fairs where I might sell my pottery, feeling completely at peace with exactly where I was and excited about where I might go next. And that's how it all played out. But I already know half of you are going to have totally different takes. Drop them in the comments. I love seeing the mix of opinions. You always make the best part of the video happen down there.